Awaken, Ifrit.
Welcome to MojoPlays, and today we're summoning everything we know as well as our best predictions for Final Fantasy XVI. What are some of your predictions for Final Fantasy XVI? Let us know down in the comments. Before we continue, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. Accessibility. The 8th generation of consoles was a huge step forward for accessibility in gaming, and the 9th generation seems to be taking even further strides for inclusivity. With all of Sony's first-party titles leading the industry as far as accessibility options for gamers with disabilities, it's only right that their third-party exclusives follow suit. Final Fantasy XVI producer Nakoya Yoshida spoke about how new systems were being implemented to help beginners ease into the series. Like many recent releases, Final Fantasy XVI will include a story mode for newcomers, but instead of simply tweaking some options in a menu, players are free to customize their level of challenge as they see fit, and respeccing their equipment to fit their playstyle and combat prowess. Exclusivity. When the Final Fantasy series began back in 1987, the series was a console exclusive for Nintendo consoles, the NES and SNES, until the release of Final Fantasy VII on Sony's then new console, the PS1, and this exclusivity continued through until Final Fantasy XII. With the release of Final Fantasy XIII, the series went fully multi-platform and has remained that way with the exception of some spin-off titles. With the release of Final Fantasy VII Remake and now Final Fantasy XVI, Sony has regained exclusivity rights for the franchise, and as the time of this writing, the latest entry is a PlayStation 5 exclusive. It's unknown if this entry will find its way to Microsoft Series consoles or even PC, but for the time being, Sony's 5th console is the only place to experience the latest entry in this long-running franchise.
What do you mean you refuse? Did you not pledge your sword?
The team.
Our kind do not question orders, we follow them.
With a series as long-running as Final Fantasy, there's no shortage of new visionaries and industry veterans to lead the creative force behind the beloved franchise. With Final Fantasy XVI, longtime Final Fantasy veterans like producer Nakoya Yoshida, Hiroshi Takai, and Kazutoyo Maehiro as main director and creative director respectively, as well as many of those responsible for the recent success of Final Fantasy XIV, the latest entry in Final Fantasy has some of the best creative minds behind its creation. And given the resounding success of Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn, the newest entry in the industry and trend-setting franchise could mark a new benchmark for the series.
Second icon of fire. But that's impossible.
Classic Final Fantasy. The Final Fantasy series has had a long and storied history when it comes to the location of its beloved tales. From the distant past of knights and sorcery, to the far-flung future with hints of steampunk thrown in for good measure, the Final Fantasy series is one of the most experimental franchises on the market. With Final Fantasy XVI, the creative teams wanted to return the series to its more classical medieval fantasy roots after the recent modernish Final Fantasy XV and the return to the steampunk future of Final Fantasy VII Remake. With warring kingdoms, knights, chocobos, and magic abilities filling the screen, Final Fantasy XVI is reintroducing longtime fans to the series' roots with modern quality of life improvements, as well as offering newcomers a glimpse into the series' origins.
The Empire will live on.
Setting.
The chaos he would wreak would sweep all of Valisthea into the abyss.
With a return to a more classic Final Fantasy setting, the world of Valisthea is home to 6 separate kingdoms, all built around the various mother crystals that grant the kingdom's various magic abilities through the power of Aether. A long-standing peace is suddenly rocked as each kingdom is affected by a mysterious blight, as well as an unprovoked attack on the main character's kingdom of the Grand Duchy of Rosaria by the icon Ifrit. With the recently released world map, we can get an idea of how each of the kingdoms has incorporated the Mother Crystal into their construction, as well as some hints to the type of traversal players can expect. The world of Valisthea might not be one of the largest Final Fantasy worlds to explore, but it certainly could be one of the most unique and beautifully detailed. Combat. Final Fantasy is one of the grandfathers of RPG turn-based combat, setting the industry standard for generations. With the release of Final Fantasy XV, the turn-based nature of the series was gone, replaced with faster, more responsive real-time combat that was arguably perfected in the recent Final Fantasy VII Remake. With the Final Fantasy VII Remake, the developers managed to find a perfect balance between classic turn-based combat and the lightning-fast real-time combat of Final Fantasy XV, and that system appears to have been expanded on with Final Fantasy XVI. Lead combat designer of Devil May Cry 5, Ryota Suzuki, has joined Creative Assembly 3 and is bringing much of the same over-the-top action the Devil May Cry series is known for to Final Fantasy XVI. Characters.
I am Joshua's shield. I'm sworn to protect him.
While we don't yet know all the major characters that would become integral to Final Fantasy XVI's story, we know of a few that could be accompanying us on this journey. Player character Clive Rosfeld, who is the firstborn son of the Archduke, was expected to inherit the dominant Phoenix, but it instead passed to his younger brother Joshua, who laments the inheritance. Without his birthright, Clive became a master swordsman and eventually the first guard of his younger brother. The two have an adopted sister, Jill Warwick, who was rescued and brought in and raised alongside the two boys and was wholly accepted as one of the royal family. Besides the brothers, so far we only know of two other dominants from the other kingdoms, Hugo Kupka of the Dalmekian Republic and dominant to Titan, and Benedicta Harmon, dominant of Garuda and an expert in backroom politics.
It was the Dalmecs who drove back the Crusaders in the Battle of the Twin Realms, was it not?
Crystals. Crystals have played a role in the majority of Final Fantasy titles dating all the way back to the original in 1987. Final Fantasy XVI looks to continue that tradition by making the iconic gemstones a major focal point of the story. Each kingdom within Valestia is built around one of the enormous crystalline shards, here called the Mother Crystals, erupting from the landscape like mountains on the horizon. Each kingdom has their own beliefs and religions based on the crystals, and the fragile peace between the kingdoms has been rocked more than once by conflict over these Mother Crystals and the power within them. While much of the focus of the story in the trailers at the moment seems to be focused on the icons, it wouldn't be much of a stretch to imagine each kingdom's crystals playing a much larger role in the overall narrative as the story progresses.
Our foe will not relinquish their Mother Crystal easily. This will be a bitter fight.
Darker tone.
Stop there!
While the Final Fantasy series has been known to tackle this serious issue from time to time, the franchise has mostly been lighthearted adventures about a group of adventurers coming together to prevent a world-ending calamity. Although there will undoubtedly still be much levity to be had, based on the trailers released so far, Final Fantasy XVI seems to be striking a decidedly darker tone from previous entries. With various shots of blood, visceral combat engagements, as well as screen-filling encounters with icons, Final Fantasy XVI seems to have more in common with Game of Thrones than Lord of the Rings. Given what we know so far, it's entirely possible Final Fantasy XVI could be one of only a few handful of titles in the franchise's storied history to earn an M rating.
I'll kill you. If it's the last thing I do.
Icons.
Awakened, if freed.
Summons and their various titles and forms have been a staple of the Final Fantasy series from its earliest days, and with Final Fantasy XVI, these great deities, here referred to as icons, will have a much more prominent role in the story than ever before. Each kingdom has their own perspective on icons, with many of them being worshipped, while others, like any born dominant to an icon in the Iron Kingdom, are unfortunately executed due to the kingdom's beliefs against the unholy abominations. Those that are born a dominant have the innate ability to call upon and possibly even transform into their respective icon, giving the player direct control over their icon in battle. Final Fantasy XVI producer Nikoi Yoshida recently stated that each icon battle will be unique and have different gameplay styles, such as everything from a fighting game to a 3D shooter. Did you enjoy this video? Check out these other clips from MojoPlays, and be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified about our latest videos.